Good morning to you all. Good afternoon if you are following us from Asia. And first of all, welcome to this online event co-organized by Casa Asia and Exterior Es Diverso. I will explain a bit about these two institutions. Casa Asia is a public entity set up 20 years ago in 2001 by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the regional government of Catalonia, and two city councils, Madrid and Barcelona. We are based here in Barcelona, but we have a second office in Madrid, and our aim is to bring the Asia-Pacific region closer. We are what it's called a public diplomacy institution. So we foster relations through different means than those that the traditional diplomacy has historically used. So we, for example, promote people-to-people exchanges, agreements between institutions such as universities, civil society organizations, etc. And we are very glad to host this first online event on being LGBTI plus in Asia. What are the challenges and good practices in this continent? And to do so with Exterior Es Diverso, which is the main foreign service platform for people belonging to the LGBTI community. It was created a few years ago, but it has been extremely active and, in my view, successful, not only in all things related to awareness raising, but also in changing practices, in changing legislation. So thank you for following us this morning. Thank you for following us this afternoon. My name is Javier Parrondo, the director of Casa Asia, and I just want to give this short introduction to give the floor to the real protagonists of this event, which are our panelists. The event will be moderated by Gael Patin, who is also a member of the staff of Casa Asia, and who is responsible for all matters related to intercultural affairs. So today we will have the participation of members of the Spanish Foreign Service and also from civil rights associations. So thank you, all of us, Luis, Timo, Cristobal, and Ryan, for your time. This online event will be followed by two others. The second one on March the 22nd, and the final one on April the 26th. This is focused basically on good practices and challenges in countries in the Southeast Asia region, such as Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and we have also included China. The second one will be more focused on countries such as Japan and South Korea, and the final one will be the other way around. We want to listen to those people of Asian origin who are living currently in Spain, so that they can share with us their experience of being LGBTI in Spain. So nothing else from my side. I would like to thank once again all followers who are connected this morning. Since the pandemic, we have launched a very broad online activity, and we have been successful in reaching out to people. So COVID-19 has not prevented us from being what we want to be, an open window from Spain to the Asia Pacific in all its diversity. And in this spirit, we organize with Exterior Es Diverso this online activity, which, as I just mentioned, will be followed by two others. So without further ado, Gael, you have the floor. Thank you for moderating this session, and I hope it will be useful for our followers. Regards from Barcelona, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Javier. We have 1 hour and 20 minutes in total. I really, first of all, want to welcome all the public, and really, I hope that you will share your questions through our chat in the Zoom and even in the YouTube chat. Thanks, Javier, to ask me to work on this project. It was very interesting, and to moderate it today. And also thank you to Javier Serrano and to Jose Maria Cantos from Exterior Es Diverso. Thanks to them, we really managed to have a really good panel for this first session. We will try to cover all the main issues in all the 3 panels, but it's impossible always to cover everything. We already have received a few messages saying that in Taiwan something really happened a few days ago, and that we should speak about all of those areas. From discrimination to homophobia, transphobia, to the fight for basic rights and the transnational advocacy, we will try to cover all of these topics today. We mainly have experts from the law field, so I think it's very interesting. And we will cover today the countries China, India, Pakistan, Thailand, and also the ASEAN transnational perspective. First of all, I would like to welcome Luis Melgar, who will speak. He's a writer and a Spanish diplomat based in Beijing. He entered the diplomacy career in 2008, and he also was under director for diplomatic policies. He's also an active member of the platform Exterior Es Diverso. So Luis will have a special role today, because he will also explain more in detail what is this platform doing, because we will ask all the panelists to explain about the organization they work in, to understand a little bit all the activist aspects, and also the situation now in the countries they speak about. So Luis, do you want to start to explain a little bit the platform Exterior Es Diverso? Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Gael. Thank you, everyone. Good evening from. In this occasion, the lecturer already told a little bit about it. So first of all, our platform is composed by all kinds of workers inside the Spanish civil service. Of course, diplomats, trade officers, all kinds of civil servants, and also local staff. So there's both Spaniards and foreigners working as members of this platform, as long as we work for the Spanish Foreign Service. And also, which is a main difference for us, with other organizations, is that also family members are active members of the organization. So we try to be flexible, informal, and wide in our scope. We have 3 main fields of working, 3 main goals in our activity. The first one is accompanying the members of the Foreign Service, the LGBT members of the civil service, in the process of getting the diplomatic visa and the diplomatic ID in foreign countries, especially where the situation of the LGBT community is not so easy. For example, in China, where I am, spouses of the same sex don't automatically get recognized as diplomatic. They don't have a diplomatic ID, not exactly. So in these kind of situations, our platform goes with us and works along with the ministry to find a suitable solution. A second line we try to work with is the consular work. We try to assure that the Foreign Service is giving our LGBT citizens the best possible service. We are thinking about consular marriage. We are thinking about attention to transgender people. We are thinking about all kinds of consular affairs that our Spanish citizens find abroad, and we try to help them from our position. And last but not least, we also work in advocacy as a kind of lobby inside our administration to assure that the human rights of LGBT people are a core part of our human rights policy. I have said many times that LGBT rights are a part of our image as a country, and we try to keep it that way. So I think that would be enough to present more or less our platform, although we will be happy to answer any kind of questions about our work.
So now, Luis, could you please explain us, of course, the situation now in China? And okay. I know you... Please.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to make two little notices before I start about this. First, I'm going to talk about mainland China. It's been mentioned before, Taiwan. The situation in Taiwan, it's completely different from the one in mainland China. And also, I'm not talking about Hong Kong, where also the situation is very different. I would say the situation is much easier for the LGBT community in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, at least for the time being. I'm going to talk about mainland China because that's where I'm placed and where I work. So that's the situation I know firsthand. And second, although I am an observer here, I'm a diplomat, as you said, at the Spanish embassy, and actually I'm in charge of human rights. So I'm dealing with these kind of things every day. But I'm not speaking as a diplomat now. I'm just speaking as a member of the LGBT community myself, who has been able to see how's the situation here. I have friends. I have a lot of connections here. I've been in Beijing for 3 years, not traveling outside of the country because of the COVID situation. So yeah, I'm expressing only my personal views here, not any official ones. That said, I can say that the situation in China is very complex. As you all know, China is a very ancient country, it's a very big country, and a very complex country. So, of course, the situation of LGBT people, it's not easy to define. We could start saying homosexuality is not forbidden. It's not illegal to be gay. Transsexual people are allowed to change their legal gender under certain circumstances. So, from that point of view, we could say that the situation, well, it's acceptable from a certain point of view. But, for example, there's not any kind of legal union between same-sex partners. It's completely impossible. Also, discrimination against same-sex couples is not protected by the law. So there's no law enforcement that will protect LGBT people who are attacked, harassed, or who lose their employ because of the sexual orientation. And finally, there's a huge social stigma. So that's also a very important thing to take into account.
Thank you, Luis. I know you wanted to speak about to speak more about the legal framework too. And also you mentioned as among the key issues, the control of culture, artists, etc. on this topic.
Okay, I can start a little bit with the legal situation because I think it's very interesting. On the one hand, homosexuality has never been forbidden in China, in mainland China. It's true that in year 1979, there was a law that was actually an anti-hooliganism law that people who know about Spain LGBT history know a little bit about Franco's law of vagos y maleantes. That's a kind of anti-hooliganism law. And there was a similar one in China. But actually, it was only against male homosexuality, and it was supposed to only prohibit sexual assault, not sexual activity. But it was used in many occasions to target the LGBT community. So if the authorities knew that you were suspicious to be gay, they would accuse you of having sexual assault. So that was one thing. But in 1997, all mentions of homosexuality were removed from the criminal law. So nothing was in the law against the LGBT community. Although we must say that the Chinese Society of Psychiatry classified homosexuality as a mental disorder up to 2001. It was in that year when it was removed from the list of diseases of mental disorders. But the authorities never implemented this change. So still today, many Chinese authorities, for example, the National Health and Family Planning Commission, which is the family branch who controls health services in China, still considers today that homosexuality might be a mental disease. And of course, when we talk about transgender identity, that's also considered a disease today in China. And that's one of the reasons why conversion therapy is still a thing that happens in China, because it's still considered somehow to be a member of the LGBT community. It's still considered to be a disorder. Also about marriage, I said before that same-sex couples have no legal status. That means that they have, as a couple, they have no access to health, to any kind of facilities if one member of the partnership dies, if there's an accident, if there's problem, of course, with the family, no adoption, nothing at all. The LGBT family is not recognized at all. They also have effects outside of China, because before COVID, now it's a little bit different. China was a country where many couples came looking for an adopted child. That was not possible for same-sex couples or even for homosexual parents. So if you were a gay or an LGBT person, you couldn't have access to that in China. Finally, there's something I think very interesting in China, that censorship has always prohibited the display of homosexual content in any form from any kind of public platforms, movies, television, anything. So yeah, I think that's this censorship is very interesting, because it's not illegal. It's not illegal to be homosexual, but it's illegal to display homosexual content publicly. And then just I want to add to the discrimination protection thing that I was telling you before. The Article 33 of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, in fact, prohibits discrimination of any kind, but it does not mention sexual orientation or gender identity. So yeah, today there are many fights in the courts because people who have been discriminated for being LGBT are suing their company, the government, the authorities, whatever, but the ruling of the courts are very different. So up to now, there's not a real protection of our community.
And Javier, before finishing your speech, can you please explain a little bit about the situation of activism in China?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because, as you know, let me see, I have it around here. Activism in China in general is very controlled. You know, the society is very closed, and the political system of China understands that the Communist Party is the natural way for the expression of the will of the people. So individual associations, NGOs, etc., is really not so common. When we talk about LGBT organizations, let's say that in a country with 1.3 billion people, we have maybe 1 or 2 dozens of LGBT organizations. It's extremely difficult to get them legalized. There's a commission who legalizes NGOs, and it's extremely tough to become legalized if you say you are going to advocate for LGBT rights. One solution that many organizations have found is to focus on providing services. For example, if you say that your aim is to take care of HIV positive people, then maybe you would have a chance to get legalized. But if you say that you are going to advocate for LGBT rights, then you will be perceived as contrary to the government, and then you will not be allowed. The result is that many organizations choose to be not legalized. They work in the shadow, and they lack resources. Especially a few years ago, like 3-4 years ago, there was a new law on the foreign NGO management. So nowadays, it's almost impossible for a Chinese NGO to receive funds from another country. That had a huge impact on our kind of organizations. So yeah, today they are very few. They work under the radar. They have no resources, and they cannot ask other countries for help. Also, there's another thing that happens here that I find quite interesting, that it's about LGBT student groups. LGBT student groups happen inside of universities, and they can be legalized by the very university. They don't have to go, let's say, to the Beijing government. So it's up to each university if they want to make them legal or not. And many of them are. Although last year, 2021, there was a coup, a kind of a change in the policy, and many of these organizations were suddenly forbidden, and even the social networks accounts were shut down. So the situation of activism is not so good. And the reason is very difficult to understand, but probably it's not because the government is targeting specifically the LGBT community, but because they want to have a control of the civil society as a whole. And they want things to be expressed through the channel of the Communist Party and not by individual organizations that might have dealings with foreign governments, foreign organizations, etc. So, yeah, I think my time might be up, but if I have a couple more minutes, I can talk something else.
That time is up for the moment, but I hope that after you can speak again. I just wanted to share 2 short questions from the public, because it's really dealing with China, and it's better that you answer as quick as possible.
No, not yet. I'm saying the Chinese version of the Spanish law that was used against LGBT people, it's called in English anti-hooliganism, and it's from 1979. I can look up the Chinese name. I'm working hard on my Chinese, but I must confess I still don't know how to say it. But in English, it's called anti-hooliganism, and it's against vandalism.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is... Yes, the second question
is about the prohibition of homosexual content. Okay, then you have to understand that the concept of law and norms in China is different. So there are compulsory laws, and there are other that are not so clearly compulsory. So this is more like a guideline from the party and from different institutions. So in general, it depends to the censorship authority to determine if a specific content is suitable or not. I mean, in this case, LGBT content. And I'm going to give you an example. In the Cervantes Institute, both in Shanghai and in Beijing, many years we try to have a LGBT movie festival. That's allowed. We can do it. Also because we are inside of a foreign cultural center, and we are somehow protected by the embassy. Somehow, not completely. But in order not to have problems, there needs to be no display of sexual activity. That would be the absolute red line. And I'm not talking about pornographic material, of course. I mean something evident. Not that it's pornographic, but that it's clearly sexual in nature. That's the red line. But of course, that's for the embassy. If you are a private organization and you, for example, you have an exhibition of, I see it answered your question. The line is very blurred. It's difficult to tell, but the general line is no. And if it's specific, the answer is no. And if it's in Chinese, it's even more difficult.
Thank you very much. This is perfect timing. So now we will pass the floor to Timo Ojanen. Timo Ojanen speaks today as a representative from the Foundation for SOGI, Rights and Justice. So please, Timo, present a little bit what is the organization doing, and then, of course, you will explain us the situation now about LGBTI rights in Thailand. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and hello, everyone. It was interesting to hear about China because I think there are some similarities in the situation. And if you don't mind, I'll point out some of those first. So Thailand also never had effective criminalization of homosexuality. And but at the same time, the legal protection or legal rights are quite limited. Like China, there's no same-sex partnership law or a same-sex marriage possibility as a legal right. And that's really one of the key things that we're working on at the moment. Thinking about the other laws, Thailand also doesn't have any kind of gender recognition law. So if you're transgender, there's no way that you can get your identification changed to your preferred gender, and that is really quite problematic. At the same time, there is a law called the Gender Equality Act, which is kind of like mostly gender identity and expression focused anti-discrimination law, and that has been used to some good effect in the recent years. The law itself is only like 7 years old. But about ForSogi, so like you can see from the name of the organization, it is actually a registered foundation, and that itself wasn't exactly unproblematic to get it registered, but we were successful. And it was incorporated about 10 years ago as a foundation, mostly focusing on sort of policy and law level issues related to rights that are somehow connected to gender identity and sexual orientation. We are not specific to any particular identity group. We are open to all, and we are trying to bring about equal rights to all groups on these issues. So that's roughly the situation. But recently, really, we have been focusing on the issue of marriage equality. And we helped a lesbian couple to bring a case to the Constitutional Court, seeing, for example, the good example from Taiwan, where this strategy was successful, but unfortunately, the court in Thailand didn't think that it was unconstitutional to limit marriage to a man and a woman. And therefore, now we are thinking about what next and, where do we go from here? I think that's the brief explanation on the situation.
Yes, but if you want, Bueno, please, the public can also share their questions now about Thailand. I think since we have listened to Luis's presentation before, you could explain us a little bit also what is the situation of the activism or even the discrimination in Thailand? Right.
So I think overall, we see those same kinds of problems as in most countries in the world, really, from self-stigma, mental health problems, lack of acceptance in families, discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in education, lack of legal rights. Like I said, I cannot get married to my partner, for example, lack of gender recognition. There are really quite a lot of issues. But maybe the level of social stigma is less intense than in China. That's my understanding. So there's a certain level of openness, but it depends on the situation. And the more formal the setting, the more difficult it is to be openly LGBTI, or the more you risk that you will be excluded or discriminated in some way. No.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to mention any other recent developments which occurred, or any challenges for really the short future. And also another question that we have from the public, you can organize your answers as you wish. How is the LGBTI plus community in the case of in the education field?
Okay, well, I should be able to answer that question because, well, I work as a lecturer at the public university. And for me, for example, it's okay to be openly gay. That's fine. But I did some research on bullying before, and that bullying faced on the basis of perceived non-conforming gender expression or perceived homosexuality, that kind of bullying is quite common. And there is also still structural discrimination. For example, in many educational institutions, you're still required to wear a certain kind of uniform, and that is determined on the basis of your birth sex rather than on your own preference. So these kinds of issues are still quite prevalent. But in terms of there was another thing about education. So the health education contents in secondary schools used to be quite stigmatizing. And there was another case which actually involved research from ForSogi as well that brought this issue to the fore. And as a result, secondary school teachers are no longer required to teach their kids that homosexuality is a sexual deviation or whatever terminology they used in the 60s. So now the contents are supposed to be a little bit more updated and accepting. So that's another positive development. Yeah.
Someone is also asking about the situation for no-binary people in Thailand.
Okay.
And a last question that I will also ask it now. It is paradoxical that Vietnamese people can go to Thailand to get sex change surgery, but Thai people cannot then change their ID cards. Is this really the situation, or is it not correct?
Yeah. Okay, for the first one, I'm not an expert on non-binary issues, but as a researcher, I would say that there has been a big sort of explosion in public awareness and sort of non-binary activists coming together and forming their own groups. So at least the awareness and the sort of the understanding that this is another possible identity, simply that's a development that I've witnessed myself over the past 5 years. So there's more visibility, and I think that's good. As for the last question, yes, anyone can come to Thailand and have a sex reassignment surgery if they pass the assessment by 2 psychiatrists, one of whom has to be Thai, and they are at least 20 years old, or 18 if they have parental permission, and they have the money to pay for the operation. It's not paid for by the state, even for Thai nationals. It's still out of pocket completely. And yeah, so this is an example of, it's not criminalized, but there's no protection and there's no welfare for you in these important issues either. Thailand does not allow anybody to change the gender on ID documents, almost. The only exception in the past has been intersex people who had a sex reassignment surgery and then kind of like went through an administrative process to prove that their sex was determined incorrectly at birth. But that's the only exception, and trans people are simply not allowed to change their gender in their documents. Change of name might be possible, but that really mostly depends on the local authorities, because this is the kind of thing that you would do at the local district office. So yeah, we see a situation of no criminalization, but also not much in the way of rights and not much in the way of welfare. And that's what we're trying to change.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you had a real debate with the public with so many questions answered now. Do you want to add something, or shall I pass to the next panelist and you may speak again later?
Maybe I can come back later if there are some more questions or issues I can link to.
Fine, yes, please don't hesitate to ask any questions. Now we will speak about India and Pakistan. So please share questions in YouTube or in the chat of the Zoom. Cristobal Alvear, welcome. He's a researcher on comparative constitutionalism and LGBT rights and a legal advisor on Asian legal systems. He's also an institutional advisor on Spain-South Asia relations and a professor of law in the School of Diplomacy and several other universities. He has worked in India and Pakistan several years, for 10 years, and he's currently living in Malaysia, but today he will focus on the recent changes in India and Pakistan. And he's a proud member of Es Diverso, as you send your presentation, and I like to share this with the public. I will first start with two questions. What is the historical background of gender and sexual identities in the Indian subcontinent? And also, of course, as you're an expert on legal issues, what have been the main legal developments since then? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gael, and thank you to Casa Asia and to Es Diverso for organizing this panel. As Gael said, I'm currently living in Malaysia, but my academic background is in India and Pakistan, so I'm going to try to answer these questions from a constitutionalism approach, always focus on India and Pakistan. Regarding the background, transgender persons, commonly known in India and Pakistan as hijras, among many other names, have been socially present in India subcontinent for centuries, embedded in its local kinship-based social structures and pertaining both to Hindu and Islamic traditions. They have been also legitimized not only by gender-fluid figures described in Asian, Hindu, and Buddhist books, but also by their highly positioned predecessors during the Islamic rule. Hijras at that time during the Mughal rule were appointed as government officials and even as military commanders. Regarding homosexual sex, homosexual love, and homoerotism, they have always been part of the subcontinental culture and society, all those indoors and in gender segregated spaces. While hijras have been part of the public life, homosexual companionship have been reduced to the private spaces. The British rule brought to India, to the Indian subcontinent, both an anti-homosexuality campaign criminalizing homosexuality under the Indian Penal Code of 1860, but also an anti-hijra campaign marginalizing them under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. So this act, this Criminal Tribes Act, was repealed in an early stage of the independent subcontinent during the surge of a post-colonial discourse on caste and classes to confront the colonial social abuses. However, the Victorian moral values on individual behaviors remain in the Indian Penal Code of 1860, a code that, by the way, is still in force nowadays, not only in India and Pakistan, and also in Bangladesh, but also in other former British colonies, such as Myanmar, Malaysia, or Singapore. Hijras were then decriminalized as a community, but not with regards to their individual behaviors. Coming to the present, although the transgender social stigmatization lasted for decades, recently the Indian subcontinent has been a forerunner in the judicial acknowledgement and legal protection of transgender persons. Since 2009, the Supreme Court of Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, in the Kaki case, it initiated a series of orders for the protections of rights and welfare of transgenders. In the case of India, in 2014, the Supreme Court in the Nalsa case recognized the application of the full range of fundamental rights to transgenders. This progressive case law paved the way for the enactment of the Transgenders Protection of Rights Act, first in Pakistan in 2018, being the first and only Muslim country in the world with a Transgender Rights Act, and a year later in 2019 in India after a couple of successful attempts. Both acts include the right of gender self-identification. On the other hand, regarding sexual orientation and sexual identities, they have faced much more challenges in the struggle for decriminalization. Although in 2009, the Delhi High Court in the Nalsa case decriminalized homosexuality, this judgment was overturned by the Supreme Court of India in 2013. It took another 5 years for the LGBTI community in India to win this battle. In 2018, the Supreme Court in the landmark Navtej Singh Johar case deemed Section 377 criminalizing homosexuality unconstitutional, declaring the constitutional protection of sexual orientation. However, Section 377 is still in force in Pakistan, and therefore homosexual sex still criminalized.
Cristobal, thank you. I know you mentioned also that what are the main specificities of the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, that have made these countries regional forerunners on transgender rights?
I will highlight two of them, Gail. Firstly, that while the Hijra identity has been marked with an indigenous difference, The localness of other sexual identities has been contested because of their alleged Western influence. Consequently, the hijra reappropriation has been part of the post-colonial narrative in the Indian subcontinent, including by conservative sections of society. And the second one is that transgender persons have found in the experiences of other minorized groups or minorities the way to grant their access to justice, and this is very important. The Indian and Pakistani Supreme Courts have developed via case law a system known as public interest litigation, PIL, that seeks the protection of disadvantaged minorities through case law. Petitions on fundamental rights can be filed directly before the High Courts or the Supreme Courts in cases of fundamental rights, and not only by the LGBT community, but also and the minorities, but also by any public-spirited citizens. This legal activism has been key in the Indian subcontinent, and most of the cases in the advancement of LGBT rights have started with a PIL, a public interest litigation petition.
Yes, thank you. And also, what triggered the recent landmark judgments in India on sexual identity rights?
In my opinion, one key aspect is the position of the Supreme Court of India as a counter-majoritarian institution, devoted to granting fundamental rights to minorities and minorized groups. The common legal path for the expansion of rights starts with case law, followed by the passing of pieces of legislation by Parliament, as it happened with transgender rights. Now in India, a new era of transformative constitutionalism has fostered new landmark judgments. This transformative vision of the Constitution is based on the ability of the Constitution to adapt and transform with the changing needs of the times, and also, and this is key, on the supremacy of constitutional morality over social morality. Consequently, constitutional morality prevails even when the majority claims for the social morality exceptions, as it happened with most of the LGBT rights cases in India. Additionally, the LGBT community has struggled together with other minorized groups, especially with women, against the patriarchal legal burdens. The 2017 Putaswamy case stated that privacy is a fundamental right under the scope of the right to life and personal liberty, creating a sort of legal safe zone for the protection of fundamental rights for all minorized groups, and enlarging the scope of privacy into new rights such as individual autonomy, dignity or self-determination. This anti-patriarchal effort links women and LGBT rights movement in the protection of their individual choices, promoting legally the achievement of their rights through intersectionality.
Thank you. And I will fusionate the last two questions. But before, I want to remind you that you can share your questions in the chat. And also, I see that we have a very active question and answer section. I think you can find it below in your screen. And thank you, Timo and Luis, for answering the questions from the specific questions from the public on medical issues, etc. So, Cristobal, the last two questions for you. What are the challenges ahead in the Indian subcontinent? And also, what are the main outcomes of the subcontinental experience? Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. So regarding transgender rights in India and Pakistan, both communities share the same concern about the differences on sexual assault penalties comparing to cisgender women, and also the need of affirmative actions in education and government posts, known as reservations, to overcome the historical marginalization that has forced them to engage into sexual and begging for a living. In Pakistan, recently, conservative Islamic parties are leading a campaign for the prohibition of gender reassignment surgeries, since they are considered to be against Islamic teachings, and a step towards, and I'm quoting them, the legalization of homosexual marriages. Although the majority of the parliament still supports it. In India, part of the transgender community has challenged the constitutionality of the 2019 Act before the Supreme Court as a step backward from the achievement of the NASA case by the Supreme Court. They have raised several concerns, including the requirement of a prior official authorization for gender self-identification. Interestingly, an additional demand of HRAS is the legal recognition of the non-biological families, given importance that the relationship, the links between the HRA guru, the teacher, and the HRA chelas. And regarding sexual identities and sexual orientation in India, same-sex marriage, non-discrimination policies, and adoptions, among other issues, are still pending. Last November, the Delhi High Court initiated the final hearings for the recognition of same-sex marriage, that, by the way, faces the opposition of the government. We will see if the Supreme Court of India upholds once again the enforcement of LGBT rights in India. And Gael, to conclude about the main outcomes of the subcontinental experience, first of all these judgments have a clear impact on society. They are social turning points. The 2009 Dance Foundation case was analyzed by the Gender Law School, stating that it increased self-acceptance and confidence, it reduced body harassment, and it achieved greater social recognitions. The 2018 Navtej Johar case brought an expansion of LGBTI presence in the public life in Indian society, including LGBTI cells in political party, LGBTI job fairs, or LGBTI clubs at universities. And the Ipsos 2021 Global Survey has shown that 56% of urban Indians have stated that the views of homosexuality have changed in the last 5 years towards acceptance, 56%. And the 2009 case and the 2018 Act in Pakistan on transgender rights have expanded transgender visibility in Pakistan for sure, including the first transgender lawyer, the first transgender uncle, and the first transgender madrasa teacher. LGBTI-wise, law changes society. Judicial battles are worthy to be encountered. And also, I want to emphasize that there is a regional interrelationship between legal systems. Neighboring case law has a clear influence, and the best example on this is the 2008 Sunil Babu Pant case by the Nepali Supreme Court, guaranteeing full rights to LGBT persons that was referred in all key judgments by the Indian Supreme Court. The 2009 Kaki case of Pakistan was also mentioned in the reasoning of the 2014 NASA case on transgender rights. Consequently, LGBT rights need regional pioneers, and same-sex marriage would be an excellent opportunity for India to be a regional leader in LGBT rights. And finally, the importance of community leaders. These landmark cases have been accomplished thanks to the commitment of LGBTI public figures, such as in the 2018 case, Navtej Johar, dancer, or Ritu Dalmia, a chef, that, among others, filed the petition for the 2018 decriminalization case. But also thanks to the legal activism of civil society, such as Islamic law scholar, Dr. Aslam Kaki, that filed a petition before the Supreme Court of Pakistan regarding the transgender rights. Key is also the involvement of LGBTI lawyers, including Saurabh Kirpal, that, by the way, has been recently awarded by Casa Asia in 2022 with the Casa Asia Award, and he's said to be the first LGBTI judge in an Indian High Court. All these achievements on LGBT rights in the Indian subcontinent has been achieved due to the role played by the community and the civil society. So I think we have a question here.
Yes, this is perfect. I wanted to mention the Casa Asia Award, yes, to Saurabh Kirpal and also Shinta Ratri from Indonesia. Thank you for mentioning them. And yes, someone is asking if you can write the name of those persons you are mentioning.
Of course, I'll do it through the chat.
Okay. If you have any other question, you can also use the question and answer section. So shall we pass on to the next panelist, and you can come back later. Please don't hesitate to share your questions. Thank you very much. Now we will give the floor to Ryan Silverio, who is Executive Director of ASEAN SOGI Caucus, I'm not sure I can pronounce it well, which is a network of human rights activists from Southeast Asia, Manila. So we will address now the possibilities of transnational cooperations and networks in the fight for the basic rights for LGBTI communities. Ryan wants to be referred to, I'm explaining a little bit his self-presentation, as they are Sia in Filipino. And they have more than 20 years experience in human rights works, especially in the areas of human rights education, research, advocacy, and program management. Ryan also has a passion for teaching. He's a professor in several universities in the Philippines. So Ryan, first of all, can you explain us a little bit about ASEAN SOGI Caucus and tell us how should we pronunciate it? And especially focusing on the ASEAN perspective, ASEAN perspectives. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Gael. Thank you, Casa Asia and Exterior Es Diverso for organizing this panel. ASEAN SOGI Caucus was formed way back in 2011 at a time when members of the ASEAN community, ASEAN governments are in the process of coming up with a regional human rights mechanism. At the time, LGBTI worldwide is not fully recognized even within human rights norms. There's a lot of debates even within the Human Rights Council as to the recognition of sexual orientation, gender identity in human rights resolutions. The same thing in Southeast Asia. As such, LGBTI activists have been pushing for the inclusion of SOGI, or sexual orientation, gender identity, which was later on expanded to include gender expression and sex characteristics into the human rights normative framework of ASEAN. And that's where ASEAN SOGI Caucus was formed. We are a network composed of more than 15 LGBTIQ organizations. We work in 11 countries in Southeast Asia. That also includes Timor-Leste. So we do advocacy work, we engage with local organizations across the region, and we try to connect local organizations through our South-South programming, through sharing of expertise, best practices in doing both local level and regional level advocacy work.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Sorry, I didn't expect. So can you now explain us, of course, you are covering 11 countries, but maybe in a general or just speaking more about the good practices of a few countries, or also the importance of the collaboration in a transnational perspective. What is the situation of LGBTI rights in the ASEAN region as far as discrimination laws, marriage rights are concerned? And also, what are the recent progresses? Thank you.
Sure.
And also, why is progress slow? What are the barriers for the progress to be faster? Thank you.
Absolutely. So, the advancement of the human rights of LGBTIQ persons in the region is a very challenging endeavor. ASEAN itself having the mandate to protect and promote the human rights of all persons as enshrined in the ASEAN Charter and the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration have so far taken unremarkable steps to address our issues. It's been a long, long time since we've been pushing even for the inclusion of SOGI in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, and the usual suspects, Brunei, Malaysia, and at that time Indonesia, weren't so open to having such categories included, even within the non-discrimination provisions of the declaration. As an institution itself, ASEAN restricts very limited spaces for meaningful interaction and dialogue, and alienating issues, advocacies, and identities that they perceive as sensitive or as not reflective of consensus amongst its members. I think this is one very structural issue within ASEAN, and that hinders LGBTI advancement is how ASEAN actually decides. We have conservative countries, including Brunei, who would always veto any reference to SOGI or inclusion of LGBTI in their plans and programs. Even inclusion of LGBTIQ activists within ASEAN formal spaces with civil society. So this is a crucial challenge. Meanwhile, there's also growing advocacy amongst local LGBTIQ groups. And for the past 10 years, we have witnessed the mushrooming of so many local organizations, usually unorganized, driven by young people, university-based, collectives of artists, and organized by different segments of the LGBTIQ movement. In Thailand, there's a new group working on non-binary persons. There's a growing organizing amongst trans persons. There's intersex activism, so on and so forth. But despite this, the rights of LGBTIQ persons continue to be perceived by governments as a Western agenda, and that our rights and lived experiences do not necessarily reflect local values and cultural context. And this narrative has been repeated many times by so many public statements of government officials. The stigmatization of our identities as immoral, as inconsistent with state-led interpretations of religion, as threats to local cultures or traditions, or worse, as threats to society in general. And there's also the prejudiced view towards certain communities. And we are always used, government officials or politicians, to instigate right-wing, conservative, public political sentiment against us as a way to cover up the disastrous mismanagement, corruption, including how many governments failed to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we've consolidated some of the views of our members and networks as to some of the key issues in Southeast Asia. First is criminalization of LGBTIQ persons. So like in the case of Indonesia, there are attempts to pathologize LGBTI persons by legalizing legalizing harmful efforts to change a person's sexual orientation and gender identity. So there are legislative moves, including passage of anti-LGBT propaganda laws, or laws couched on the treatment and prevention of sexual orientation and gender identity disorder, or laws ensuring family resilience. Malaysia, of course, is also a big problem. You've got Section 377 of the Penal Code, which is something that runs in common with Singapore, Myanmar, and Brunei. And there's also attempts, particularly by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, to intensify penal measures against LGBTI persons. There's also the issue of absence of domestic laws and policies to protect LGBT persons from all forms of discrimination and violence. What is very interesting in Southeast Asia is that we do not have a specific country that has a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation protecting, persons of diverse SOGI. So this is a crucial challenge. Like in the case of the Philippines, decades-long attempts to legislate a SOGI equality bill has not seen any success. In Timor-Leste, there was also some push for the inclusion of LGBTI persons in the constitution, but it hasn't met any positive advances. But what is interesting as well, on the other hand, is increasingly there are certain laws or policies where reference to SOGI SC are getting into. One case example is the Myanmar child rights law, where they recognize sexual orientation as one of the non-discriminatory provision. In the Philippines, you have the Safe Spaces Act, which criminalizes online harassment, verbal harassment that are transphobic or homophobic. So maybe that can also be a good entry point as a strategy. Identify some low-hanging fruits where we can potentially insert SOGSC as one of the protected categories. What else? So there's also the barriers to access and enjoyment of social services amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. One case in point that was raised many times by our transgender friends, such as in the case of Indonesia, is the mandatory. The requirement to produce the ID cards as part of the process in accessing COVID-19 relief packages or vaccines. I understand that there has been some discussions with relevant ministries to skirt away with this requirement, but during the early part of the pandemic, this requirement of producing the ID cards has been a hindrance amongst the trans community. And then also the usual interpretation of household as heteronormative family or traditional family. And this, like in the case of the Philippines, this has excluded LGBTI couples or even single-headed households from receiving the so-called ayuda or the COVID-19 relief packages. Lastly, there's also the shrinking democratic spaces and its consequences to LGBTIQ activism. In the past years, you have witnessed the bold and brave engagement of LGBTI activists within the pro-democracy struggles, such as in the case of Thailand, such as in the case of Myanmar. Unfortunately, this has also led to many reprisals. Like, for example, a report by the National Unity Government of Myanmar, which was prepared back in July 2021, indicated that at least 12 LGBTI people were shot to death. Hundreds were detained, arrested, tortured, and jailed, and hiding to avoid military arbitrary arrest. This is in relation to LGBTI participation in the pro-democracy struggles. And also see in the case of Malaysia, where LGBTI activists have been involved in anti-corruption campaigns, pro-women's rights marches, and yet government criticized it, like back in 2019 when LGBT activists joined the Women's Day March. Some government officials considered that as an abuse of democratic spaces. So these are some of the key issues overall in the region. But I think a key concept that I wish to emphasize is intersectionality. There's always this thinking that when we talk about LGBT rights, we deal with the usual suspects around marriage equality, non-discrimination, or criminalization of LGBTI. But if you're going to look at the issues in different countries more acutely, you can see diverse range of issues. Like, for example, very recently, just like last December, in the Philippines and in Malaysia, there has been issues around LGBTI activists and organizations who were affected by the recent typhoons or disasters and necessarily act on it. Persons caught within emergency. For us in Asia and SOGICOCOS, our mandate is really to look at the issues that aren't well spoken within the community and to have it raised in the regional agenda, such as in ASEAN. Thanks, Gael.
No, thank you very much. So thank you, Ryan, Timo, Luis, and Cristobal, and also Javier for the presentation. Now, please don't hesitate. We will have a short moment for a debate. Please don't hesitate to also refer to each other or ask each other. I will first give you the floor. I just wanted to sum up a little bit. Of course, the situation in Asia is very diverse. We saw this, and that often the civil society demands there is still a gap between civil society demands and laws, actual laws, and also the activists in some cases can organize even internationally, and in other cases they just work underground. So I have a question if nobody asks any, but first I will give you the floor, and please don't hesitate to refer to each other. Do you have any question?
So, Gael, just have a question for Ryan, because we have lost you when you were speaking about intersectionality. So can you go back to your the final part of your speech and develop the idea of intersectionality that you were explaining? Because we lost your speech due to a problem with internet.
Yeah. Thanks, Gail. I think I've mentioned about issues, for example, raised by LGBTI in different contexts, such as those in humanitarian disasters or emergencies. That's one. Another potential area where intersectionality can be put forward is the cross-cutting of democratization, shrinking civil society spaces, and LGBTI activism. There has been talk around curtailment of freedom of speech, anti-pornography agenda, or censorship of LGBTI content. So this is also something that LGBTI activists deal with.
Thank you, Ryan. Does anyone else have any other comment on Timo? Or?
Yeah, there is something I could maybe expand on from what Ryan said earlier about the heteronormative framing of families. Now, I have a quote here that I'm going to put in the chat box. This is from the Constitutional Court's ruling. The Thai Constitutional Court in their ruling said last year that the purpose of marriage is for a man and a woman to cohabit as husband and wife, to form a family institution, to have children and maintain the race according to nature, to inherit property and estate, and to pass on the bonds between father, mother, siblings, uncle and aunt. Marriage between people with gender diversity may not be able to create such a delicate bond. And that's what the court said. And I think that's an example of how it's really an example of the kind of heteronormativity that Ryan talked about. So even if our unions, same-sex couples are not seen as sinful or as morally abhorrent or anything like that, at the same time, they are not being seen as real families. So our marriages wouldn't be seen as real marriages. And that's also why institutions like the court might think that we don't really deserve family benefits, for example. And that's why it's not a problem if we don't have legal recognition. So some of you may have heard that the Thai bureaucracy itself has been preparing a partnership law that would be not quite marriage, but like a civil union type of law. But interestingly, the one thing that it would not give would be spousal benefits. So the condition of passing this law is that it must not cost the state a penny. In what year? That was last year, 2021, in November. And so the idea would be, okay, we can provide this special law for you so that you can arrange your inheritance issues and things like that, but no spousal benefits. And based on the interactions that Vorsogi has had with many of the actual couples that need this kind of law, they are these day-to-day financial issues, really, more than symbolic recognition or anything. If for example, one in the couple is a civil servant and has civil servant benefits, then quite clearly the other person in the couple might also need access to those benefits, like any heterosexual couple would have, or even like medical consent issues. Those kinds of issues are quite crucial. So if the state is going to give us a special law with special limitations, it's still not really real equality. And that's why I think we need to keep pushing for real gender-neutral marriage. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Someone in the public is asking, in what year did the Thai court say this, the quote you shared?
Yeah, that was from last year, 2021.
21. If Cristobal and Luis do not have any comment on what you just said, there is a question for India and Pakistan. Is it for cultural products related to LGBT content forbidden? Or what kind of a censorship is there in India and Pakistan? Thank you.
So that's
maybe.
It's absolutely forbidden and illegal in Pakistan. It's not illegal since 2019 in India.
Okay, so I wanted to comment further on what we were commenting before about the perception that a couple, a marriage, is supposed to have children. Because in my experience, that's a general view in Asia and specifically in China. That's maybe at the core of the problematic perception. For families, the most important duty of children is to have more children. So also consider that in China for a long time, families were only allowed one kid. So if that kid is LGBT and in the mind of their parents is not going to have children, that's the end for them. They are never going to have descendants. So that's the most severe crime that you could make against your mother. As a little personal experience, I have friends, Chinese friends, who has been married to foreigners in LGBT couples. And maybe they have got children, maybe through surrogacy or maybe adopted or whatever. But suddenly the attitude in China is not mainly against the fact that a person is LGBT or something like that. It's about them not having kids. This can be complemented with another thing, that now there's a campaign among many Chinese authorities against effeminate males. So this is happening recently. We have had a ruling by the National Congress that recommends high schools to be tougher on male teenagers because they have to be more masculine. If they are soft or effeminate, that could be dangerous towards the power of China. And also, effeminate influencers are supposed to be banned now from social media. And we have seen many Chinese influencers that somehow are perceived as effeminate, and they have been erased from the internet. And that's very worrisome. And I want to connect this last comment to a question I'm seeing here about the situation of lesbian persons in Asia. And so is it more difficult or not? Well, we'll know, at least that's my view, that in general, life for women is always harder than for men everywhere. And for lesbians, that's not an exception. In China, it's still the same because as a lesbian, probably you will even be forced, not violently, but by the society, you will be forced to marry a guy. That's something that will happen. Your parents could get you to do it. But on the other hand, they don't face this criminalization of their attitude. There's nothing wrong with a woman being too masculine. That's perceived as something powerful and good. So I don't know. I still think that life for lesbians in general is more difficult. Of course, they have all the trouble of being LGBT and all the trouble of being women. So that's probably double amount of problems. But in this specific case, now in China, as it's so important to be perceived as powerful and strong, this perception of effeminate is prosecuted right now.
Sure, maybe I can respond to that very briefly. In our report just launched last year, this is the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTI organizations. We have interviewed leaders of many LBQ or lesbian, bisexual, queer women-led organizations in Southeast Asia. And amongst the key issues that they highlighted was on the issue of domestic violence. The prolonged lockdown period, specifically for lesbian, bisexual, and queer women, has instigated more fear, anxiety, especially with regards to relationships with families who do not necessarily accept them, or even amongst same-sex couples cohabitation, there's also an reported increase of domestic violence. I'd like to share one data here, which came from Sayoni, an LBQ women's organization in Singapore, where they did a survey of close to 500 respondents. 3 in 5 respondents faced challenges with their mental health. And this was exacerbated by, number 1, health status, number 2, socioeconomic stress, number 3, because of the hostile family environments to which they have to live during the pandemic. So I think when it comes to LBQ issues, the issue of domestic violence is really something there right in front of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Timo and Cristobal, do you want to comment about the situation on lesbians?
Maybe a little bit. So based on the research I've read and the conversations I've had with lesbian activist friends, I understand that, let's say, if in a family their daughter is in a lesbian relationship, it may not be such a big issue as if their son was in a gay relationship. It might not be seen. It might even be less of an issue than if the daughter was in a heterosexual relationship, because if the daughter is with another woman, at least she won't get pregnant. And that seems to be a big anxiety in many Thai families. But at the same time, the couple wouldn't be, in many families, wouldn't be understood to be a real couple again, not a real family. Just a face, just friends being very intimate or something like that. So again, it's the same issue of not maybe so aggressively opposing it, but also not recognizing it for what it is and not giving it the recognition that it needs.
Thank you very much. Cristobal, did you want to comment?
Yes, and in India, lesbians face invisibility. There are more women closeted than men. That's a fact. Also, the idea that they live in patriarchal families, and in the Indian traditional values, you need a man in your life. So it's very challenging for women in India to send a message to the family that they can be together without the figure of a man. They live under patriarchal structures, and these families are under the considerations of patriarchal values. And for sure, they face more problems than men in India. And of course, in Pakistan, there is no visibility at all of lesbians.
Thank you, Cristobal. Ryan, you have a personal question in the chat that maybe you can answer. And also, please share. We will use the last 5-8 minutes together because it's too bad not to listen to you a little bit more. Thank you to Ryan and Timo who mentioned the COVID pandemic. I think it's interesting if you also want to comment on the effects maybe in slowing down all the activism and the changes it could have had on this general situation of LGBTI community, and also what can international institutions like a UN or European Union, what can they do to help a little bit about this situation? Or is it really a barrier because anything coming from other international institutions would look like representing the Western agenda, like one of the panelists explained before? I don't know. If you have any comment on this or on those two points, please feel free.
For Thailand and for Sogi, I think one of the most concrete issues that we saw was the financial hardship that many people faced, because especially many trans people are in sort of insecure employment, maybe as vendors in the markets or working in beauty salons or bars or the tourism industry, all these kinds of employment contexts where there's not much protection. So when the COVID epidemic hit Thailand, many of these people lost their jobs or their livelihoods. And Forsogi actually channeled some aid funds from Outright to a number of people in Thailand. So from their applications that we could see how it was really affecting these people who were already in kind of vulnerable situations. And I think for many of them, the reason why they would be in such vulnerable situations would be because, again, if you're visibly trans, for example, it's much harder to find jobs in the formal employment structure that have more protection. So I think really the livelihood issues would be a key issue.
Thank you.
In the case of India and Pakistan, the pandemic has shown that the livelihood of transgenders is at the streets. So with all the lockdowns, they have faced a lot of problems to get the regular incomes. But on the other hand, pandemic has also shown how big and how strong are the networks of transgenders in India and Pakistan, and how they have supported each other and the community, creating new shelters, creating new structures to protect them and to give them food and bed and assistance. So it's like it has been very challenging, but it has been also very promising in the way of how strong are transgender networks in India and Pakistan.
Thank you. Luis and Ryan, do you want to comment on this?
Okay, I can say something about the COVID situation. I guess you are probably aware that the policy in China is quite specific and different from the world. We are now extremely strict. So during the pandemic, the situation here has been that the state has increased the social control. So activism and civil society has almost shut up in the whole country, not only about LGBT issues, but in general, because somehow the health control that is used to avoid the virus from growing in the country is also used to tighten the control on civil society and organizations. So as far as I know, most LGBT organizations are now almost inactive or working under the radar. So the impact has been huge. On the other hand, the international, what can we do? Well, we need to be very careful because, as you said before, if it's perceived as a foreign intrusion, then it's counterproductive. It's going to be worse. And then, obviously, these organizations, what they truly need is money. And it's very delicate. Of course, there are ways, but it's difficult. So I think we need to listen. What we need to do from the United Nations, the European Union, etc., is listen to the activists and see what they need and try to help them the way they ask, and not try our experience because sometimes when we come from some countries, we think that we know everything and we don't. So I think it's better that we listen and then we try our best to help.
Thank you. Any last comment? Ryan?
Sure, Gael. This is something about multilateral platforms and perhaps ways how Spain can influence this to benefit LGBTI in Southeast Asia. Number one, leverage on the UN human rights review processes like the UPR. We've seen Spain continuously raising LGBTI or SOGI issues whenever Asian countries are being reviewed. So this is something that can be done. It's not actually Spain imposing something to another country, but rather listening to the LGBT activists as to the policy and programmatic recommendations that should be amplified in the review process. Second is leveraging on bilateral or regional level interactions, like, for example, dealing with governments, dealing with the ASEAN itself, raising LGBTI in human rights discussions. So, for example, there's the ASEAN-EU policy dialogue on human rights. Perhaps Spain can utilize its experience in incorporating non-discrimination in its country experience and see how we can navigate it in within Southeast Asia. And then number three, it's really supporting local activism. As I've mentioned earlier, in the past 10 years, there's been a blossoming of so many LGBT groups. Sadly, very few groups even have legal recognition. Very, very few groups have more sustained funding for their operations. For us in ASE, we're fine. Thanks to many of our supporters, but we are mindful of the smaller organizations, youth-led organizations, who are mostly run by volunteers. Perhaps it's high time for Spain to think about leveraging on its development agenda within Southeast Asia. Are there development partners of Spain working closely with small grassroots LGBTI organizations in countries where they are stationed? Perhaps it's something to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless a hand is raised, we will finish here. Please stay tuned on our website because we will have the two next panels. I even wrote down a few issues that maybe we should tackle more in depth. And we have recorded the session, so soon we will share it in the Casa Asia's networks and Exterior Es Diverso. I also saw that several of the panelists have social networks, so if you want to be more informed about the situation in those countries, please follow them and all the organizations. And thank you again to Exterior Es Diverso. Thank you, Timo, Ryan, Cristobal, and Luis for this very good, I think, and very interesting and challenging and inspiring panel. Thank you very much.